You should recall that the marginal utility is the additional amount of satisfaction that someone gets when they consume the next unit of some good. Well, we have a utility maximizing rule that we follow in economics that says if you equate the marginal utility per dollar spent on each one of the goods that you might have the ability to choose from among, then you will maximize your total utility. And to understand that, I think it's helpful to understand that you can think of the marginal utility of something per the dollar price that you pay for something as like the bang for the buck that you get out of consuming that product. In other words, per dollar spent on that product, how much additional utility do you get? And so based on that, if that's your frame of reference, it should make sense that if at any time the marginal utility per dollar spent on one good is not equal to the marginal utility per dollar spent on another good, specifically if it's greater than, you'd want to consume more of that because you're getting more satisfaction per dollar spent on that than you are the other good. And your author has an example of how we would use, just in a simple two-product decision-making process, how we would employ that and what that would look like. So he gives you an example of where apples cost $1 per unit and oranges cost $2 per unit. And he just hypothetically tells you, assume that the marginal utility of the first apple is 10, the second one's 8, the third is 7, the fourth is 6, and so on. Well, if the dollar price is $1, then the marginal utility per dollar spent is going to be whatever the marginal utility is in this column divided by 1, so they're always going to be the same. So the marginal utility per dollar spent is also going to be 10, 8, 7, 6, and so on. For oranges, he says assume the marginal utility of the first orange consumed is 24, but it has a product price of $2. So if you divide 24 by $2, you get the per dollar marginal utility, and that is 12. 20 divided by 2 is 10, 18 divided by 2 is 9, 16 divided by 2 is 8, and so on and so forth. So what he's done in these two columns is, in this column, he's calculated that ratio of the marginal utility per dollar spent on one good. We could assume maybe that's the marginal utility per dollar spent for apples. And then in this far right-hand column, he's calculated that same ratio, the marginal utility per dollar spent on oranges, and we could say, well, maybe that's the marginal utility per dollar spent on product B in our equation here. So how does a consumer, and you know, students will all the time talk about how, well, nobody thinks about this when they're making purchasing decisions. Well, that's true, absolutely. Economists agree with that. Nobody goes around thinking about what their marginal utility per dollar spent on something. But remember, as your author discusses in Chapter 1, so much of what we illustrate in a Principles of Economics course is just a different way of explaining the world around us, what's actually happening around us. We do this subconsciously. Nobody consciously does this calculation, but we make our decisions. It's human nature to make our decisions in a way that makes us the best off that we can be. So the way a consumer would approach their decision with regard to, well, are they going to buy the first unit of apples or are they going to buy the first unit of oranges? Well, they're going to naturally, again, we assume rational behavior in economics always, they're going to engage in that activity which gives them, again, the most bang for the buck. Which one is that? Well, that would be the first unit of an orange because it gives me 12 units of satisfaction per dollar spent, and the first unit of the apple only gives me 10. So now I've already consumed the first orange, and now I'm deciding, am I going to consume the first apple or the second orange? Well, they're both equal. See, the marginal utility per dollar spent on the first apple is 10. The marginal utility per dollar spent on the second orange is 10. So at that point, I'm truly indifferent. I could do either one. So let's say just arbitrarily, I could do either one. The outcome will be the same. But let's say I go ahead and I consume that first unit of the apple and enjoy that $10 of marginal utility per dollar spent. So now I'm faced with, I have the first orange, I have the first apple, and I'm faced with, am I going to buy the second unit of either one? Again, I'm always going to go toward that one that gives me the most satisfaction per dollar spent. And in this case, that would be the second orange rather than the second apple, because the second orange gives me 10 units of additional satisfaction per dollar spent versus only 8. I'm then faced with, am I going to buy that second apple yet, or am I going to buy the third orange? Again, I'm going to compare the marginal utility per dollar spent, and rational behavior says that third orange is going to give me the greatest amount of satisfaction per dollar spent, so I'm going to do that one. Well, now I'm faced with deciding, am I going to buy the fourth orange or the second apple? Well, assuming I have money left, and I haven't talked about the whole income, he says in the example that you're constrained by income. He does talk about the budget constraint earlier in the chapter. I'm assuming everybody can pretty easily understand that. So assuming you have not yet exhausted your $10 worth of income, which we haven't yet, it cost me $2 for the first orange, an additional $2 for the second, an additional $2 for the third, so that's $6 plus $1 for the first apple. So I've only spent $7 of my $10 worth of income. I can still consume some more stuff. So again, I'm faced with, am I going to consume the second apple, or am I going to consume the fourth orange? Well, they're equal again, so I'm truly indifferent. Let's say we're neglecting apples. We'll buy that second apple because I'm indifferent. They're both 8. Well, now I have, out of my $10 worth of income, I now have $2 left. So I can still consume. Am I going to buy that fourth unit of oranges or the third unit of apples? Well, obviously, I'm only going to choose to buy the fourth unit of oranges because that marginal utility of 8 is per dollar spent is greater than the marginal utility of 7 per dollar spent for the apples. I've now exhausted my $10 worth of income, so I'd love to be able to consume more of apples and oranges both if I could, but I can't because I don't have the income. And note that when I've exhausted my income, the ending marginal utility per dollar spent on both of these goods is equal. It's $8 per dollar, or 8 units of marginal utility rather per dollar spent for both apples and oranges. So they're equal, and that satisfies the equation, if I can get my pen to cooperate here. Satisfies the equation or the equality that says you will maximize your total utility if you consume where the marginal utility per dollar spent on each good is the same while exhausting your income. If you were to calculate the total utility of consumption of apples and oranges for this person, you would see that there's no other combination. I'm going to take the time to do that here. You could easily do that yourself. You would see that there's no other combination of apples and oranges given their $10 worth of income that would give them greater total satisfaction than the consumption of 4 units of oranges and 2 units of apples. I hope that clears up the marginal utility per dollar spent or utility maximizing principle. Thanks.